Have you ever had that strange sensation that the wisest people around you seem to carry an invisible weight on their shoulders? Have you noticed how those who truly understand the complexity of the world often remain silent, while simpler, more assertive voices dominate conversations? There is a cruel irony in our society. The more someone truly comprehends the intricate nature of reality, the more painful that comprehension becomes, and the more that person tends to withdraw from the public stage where their wisdom would be most needed. This is not a casual observation, but a pattern that repeats throughout human history and intensifies dramatically in our contemporary world. We live in a time when the complexity of the challenges we face as a species has never been greater. But paradoxically, the voices that could guide us through this complexity are increasingly marginalized, not by external force, but by the very devastating nature of their knowledge. Imagine for a moment the experience of someone who spends years studying climate change, not just the superficial data we see in headlines, but the intricate web of interconnected systems that govern our planet. This person knows the positive feedbacks that accelerate warming, understands how small changes can trigger irreversible cascades, sees with mathematical clarity how our present actions mortgage the future of billions of unborn human beings. For this person, every flight they take, every product they consume, every political decision they witness carries an existential weight that most of us simply cannot imagine. This is the first phase of wisdom as pain, acute awareness of the consequences of our collective actions. But the pain goes beyond factual knowledge. It extends to understanding the fundamental limitations of human nature and the very impossibility of adequately communicating this urgency to a society operating on attention cycles measured in seconds and instant gratification. Throughout history, we observe this same pattern repeating in different forms. Socrates, considered the wisest man in Athens by the Oracle of Delphi, spent his final years systematically questioning the certainties of his contemporaries, demonstrating the fragility of our knowledge and the illusion of our wisdom. His reward was to be considered a corrupter of youth and condemned to death, not because his ideas were false, but precisely because they were too true, because they uncomfortably exposed the ignorance masked as knowledge that sustained the social structures of his time. Galileo faced the same dilemma when his astronomical observations contradicted not only religious doctrine, but the entire worldview that gave meaning and stability to the medieval world. The truth he discovered was literally unbearable for a society built on opposite premises. His wisdom was not celebrated, but persecuted, because it revealed the fragility of the foundations upon which his civilization was built. Darwin hesitated for decades before publishing his theory of evolution, not for lack of evidence, but because he perfectly understood the devastating implications of his discoveries for the sense of purpose and special dignity that humans attributed to themselves. He knew he was offering humanity a truth it was not prepared to accept, a wisdom that would cause more suffering than relief. This pattern reveals something fundamental about the relationship between knowledge and suffering. It's not simply that ignorance is bliss, but that there is a point on the knowledge curve where understanding becomes a source of existential isolation. The more deeply we understand the complex systems that govern our reality, the more clearly we see our own powerlessness before them. In modern psychology, we observe this phenomenon through what some researchers call analysis paralysis or depression of knowledge. Studies show that people with greater analytical capacity and knowledge about existential risks tend to present higher levels of anxiety and depression, not because they are pessimistic by nature, but because their capacity to process complex information exposes them to realities that less analytical minds can ignore or simplify. Consider, for example, an economist who dedicates their life to understanding the mechanisms of global inequality. This person doesn't just see statistical numbers, but comprehends the systemic structures that perpetuate poverty, the vicious cycles that keep billions of people trapped in subhuman conditions, the political and economic forces that make simple solutions impossible to implement. For this person, every superficial political discussion, every simplistic proposal, every reductionist analysis is a painful reminder of the distance between the real complexity of problems and our society's capacity to deal with them adequately. Modern technology intensifies this dilemma in ways our ancestors could never imagine. An artificial intelligence specialist who truly understands the implications of AGI doesn't see just a fantastic tool or a distant threat, but an event that could fundamentally alter the nature of conscious experience in the universe. This person carries the weight of knowing that we are potentially approaching a turning point in cosmic history, but is unable to communicate the magnitude of this transformation to a society obsessed with short-term metrics and entertainment. The pain of wisdom lies not only in what we know, but in the impossibility of adequately sharing that knowledge. Imagine trying to explain quantum mechanics to someone who has never studied physics, or trying to convey the experience of a Beethoven symphony to someone who has never heard music. The frustration is not in the inadequacy of the receiver, but in the very limitation of language and shared experience as a medium for transmitting complex insights. This is perhaps the cruelest dimension of wisdom. It isolates us not only by the depth of what we know, but by the impossibility of translating that knowledge into effective collective action. A climatologist can spend 30 years studying atmospheric systems, can see with crystal clarity the patterns leading to ecological collapse, can even manage to communicate these patterns to other scientists, but remains fundamentally powerless before the political and social inertia that prevents implementation of necessary changes. The sociologist who understands the mechanisms by which societies radicalize and fragment watches, often in silence, while their own society replicates exactly the historical patterns they studied. Their wisdom becomes a source of torment because it allows them to see the future with a clarity others don't possess, but doesn't grant them the power to alter it. Here we reach the core of the issue. Why do the wise become invisible? Why are those we most need to hear often the ones who speak least? The answer lies not only in the pain of possessing knowledge, but in the fundamentally social nature of suffering. When someone carries insights that are systematically rejected, ignored, or misunderstood by the majority, that person faces an existential choice. Continue trying to communicate their wisdom and face the constant frustration and isolation this entails, or withdraw to preserve their mental sanity. This withdrawal is not cowardice, but a natural psychological response to what psychologists call repetitive invalidation trauma. When someone repeatedly offers valuable insights that are dismissed, ridiculed, or simply ignored, the natural self-preservation mechanism eventually leads them to silence. Society loses access to their wisdom not because they stopped knowing, but because they stopped trying to teach. There is also a more subtle dimension to this invisibility. Truly wise people often develop a deep understanding of the relativity and contingency of human knowledge. They recognize that even their most refined insights are limited, incomplete, potentially incorrect. This epistemic humility, which should be celebrated as a sign of true wisdom, paradoxically puts them at a disadvantage in a social environment that values confidence and assertiveness above nuance and qualification. In public debates, casual conversations, and even academic environments, the voices that sound most authoritative and confident tend to dominate, regardless of their factual accuracy or depth of insight. The true expert, aware of the limitations of their knowledge and the complexity of the systems they study, often hesitates where the pseudo-expert advances with confidence. Genuine wisdom comes accompanied by acute awareness of one's own limitations, while ignorance frequently manifests as unshakable certainty. This phenomenon is amplified exponentially in our digital era. Social media algorithms are programmed to promote content that generates engagement, which often means content that provokes intense emotional reactions: outrage, fear, anger, excitement. Nuanced insights, careful analysis, and complex wisdom rarely generate this type of viral engagement. A superficial and controversial tweet can reach millions of people, while a careful and well-founded analysis remains buried in digital noise. The true sage, aware of this dynamic, faces an additional moral dilemma. They can simplify their ideas, present them in a more digestible and controversial way to reach a larger audience, but this requires sacrificing precision and nuance. Alternatively, they can maintain the intellectual integrity of their insights, but accept that their influence will be limited to increasingly smaller circles of people willing to invest the time and effort necessary to understand complex ideas. Many choose the second option, contributing to their growing social invisibility, not because they are elitist or arrogant, but because they understand that some truths simply cannot be compressed into palatable formats without losing their essence. It's like trying to explain the subtleties of a Pessoa poem through Instagram memes. Technically possible, but fundamentally destructive to what makes the insight valuable in the first place. The COVID-19 pandemic offered us a vivid example of this pattern in action. Epidemiologists and virologists who spent decades studying infectious disease dynamics found their complex insights competing with simplistic conspiracy theories and magical solutions in the marketplace of ideas. Professionals who deeply understood the uncertainty inherent in the early stages of a pandemic, who knew that recommendations would have to evolve as new data emerged, were criticized for changing their minds when compared to charlatans offering false but comforting certainties. This experience was traumatic for many in the scientific community, not just because of professional frustration, but because of the painful recognition that decades of expertise could be dismissed by the public in favor of simpler and more emotionally satisfying explanations. Many of these experts, after the pandemic, became more reluctant to engage with public discourse, contributing to the problem we are exploring. But the issue goes beyond technical experts. Consider veteran teachers who spent decades observing educational patterns, who understand the difference between superficial learning and genuine intellectual transformation. These educators often watch in silence while well-intentioned but ill-informed educational reforms are implemented, knowing that their objections based on experience will be labeled as resistance to change or attachment to the status quo. The same pattern repeats in fields like social work, where professionals who have worked for years with marginalized populations develop a nuanced understanding of the systemic causes of poverty and addiction, only to see their perspectives eclipsed by simplistic political narratives that reduce complex issues to partisan talking points. The invisibility of the wise is not just an individual loss, but a collective catastrophe. Societies that systematically marginalize their most informed and reflective voices are essentially choosing voluntary blindness at a historical moment when we desperately need clear vision. We are navigating challenges of unprecedented complexity, climate change, technological revolution, social transformation, existential risks, using inadequate mental maps, because the people capable of drawing better maps have withdrawn from the collective navigation process. This dynamic creates a vicious cycle. The more true experts withdraw from public discourse, the more this space is filled by less qualified but more willing voices to simplify complex issues. This, in turn, further degrades the quality of public dialogue, making it even less attractive to people who value precision and nuance. The result is a downward spiral where genuine wisdom becomes progressively more isolated from decision-making that most needs it. Recognizing this pattern does not mean accepting it as inevitable. There are paths to restore the visibility of wisdom, but they require conscious efforts from both the wise and the society that needs their guidance. For bearers of complex knowledge, this may mean developing new communication skills, finding creative ways to translate insights without sacrificing their essence, creating alliances with talented communicators who can serve as bridges between intellectual and popular worlds. For society at large, it means cultivating what we could call collective epistemic humility, a recognition that the most important problems we face are inherently complex and that simple solutions are often illusory. It means rewarding nuance instead of certainty, valuing real qualifications and experience instead of superficial charisma, creating spaces where complex ideas can be explored without the pressure of instant viralization. We also need to recognize that the pain of wisdom is real and that those who carry it deserve support, not just our admiration, creating communities of practice where experts can share both knowledge and the emotional burden of possessing that knowledge, establishing institutional structures that protect dissenting and minority voices within fields of expertise, developing social rituals that honor the contribution of those who dedicate their lives to understanding complex systems, even when their insights are inconvenient or disturbing. The issue also invites us to rethink our cultural relationship with knowledge and expertise. In a democracy, there is natural tension between the value of expertise and the value of popular participation in decision-making. But this tension doesn't need to be resolved through denial of expertise or authoritarian imposition of technical knowledge. Instead, we can seek models of governance and social dialogue that honor both specialized wisdom and the lived experience of the general population. This may seem like an impossible task, but history shows us examples of societies that manage to integrate complex wisdom with democratic participation. Classical Athens, despite its problems, developed institutions that allowed both popular debate and consultation with experts. Some modern democracies have created structures like scientific advisory councils that serve as bridges between technical knowledge and political process. The challenge of our time is to reinvent these bridges for an era of exponential complexity. We need new models of public communication that can transmit sophisticated ideas without simplifying them to irrelevance. We need new educational structures that prepare citizens to navigate complex information environments without being seduced by false certainties. We need new forms of social organization that create incentives for wisdom instead of just popularity or profit. But perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that the invisibility of the wise is not just their problem, but a symptom of our own collective reluctance to face difficult truths. On some level, we marginalize wisdom because it confronts us with realities we would prefer to ignore. It's more comfortable to believe in simple solutions, blame convenient scapegoats, maintain comforting illusions about our ability to control complex systems. The true solution to this problem requires not only that we create better platforms for wisdom, but that we develop greater collective courage to hear inconvenient truths. It means accepting that some of the challenges we face may not have easy solutions, that some necessary changes may be painful, that some aspects of our current lifestyle may be unsustainable. This journey toward renewed visibility of wisdom will not be easy or quick. It demands transformation, both individual and institutional. It requires that we recognize that genuine wisdom is often a burden as much as a gift, and that those who carry it deserve our support and gratitude, not our disdain or indifference. In the end, the choice is ours. We can continue living in a world where the wisest voices remain marginalized while we face existential challenges, or we can do the difficult work of creating spaces where complex wisdom can flourish and influence our collective decisions. The second option requires that each of us take responsibility not only for seeking knowledge, but for creating the conditions where that knowledge can be shared and applied for the common good. I need to pause here to ask you directly. In your own life, have you ever felt the weight of knowing something that others around you prefer to ignore? Have you experienced the frustration of having important insights that seem impossible to communicate adequately? I know that many of us carry fragments of this painful wisdom, each in our area of experience or interest. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It could be as simple as writing, "I feel this pain of wisdom when I try to explain." Your honesty can help others feel less alone on this journey. And perhaps together we can find better ways to make our collective wisdom more visible and useful. The future of our species may depend on our ability to solve this paradox. How to make those who best understand our complex situation also be those most heard and valued in our decision-making processes. This is not about creating a technocracy where experts rule without accountability, but about developing a mature democratic culture that can integrate genuine expertise with meaningful popular participation. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, I invite you to join this ongoing conversation. By subscribing to the channel, you connect with a community of people who recognize that the challenges of our time require not just information, but true wisdom. Together, we can explore ways to make this wisdom more visible, more accessible, and more influential in building the future we all share. This is not just an academic discussion, but an urgent necessity for any society that wants to successfully navigate through the monumental transformations of our era. The central question remains before us. Will we be able to create a world where wisdom is celebrated instead of feared, where complexity is embraced instead of simplified, where those who carry the burden of deep knowledge can share it without becoming invisible? The answer depends on choices each of us makes every day about what kinds of voices we choose to amplify, what kinds of ideas we choose to value, and what kind of society we choose to build together. Information isn't truth. Most information is junk.
Yeah.
It's fiction and delusion and lies, and there are three reasons for it. First of all, the truth is costly, whereas fiction is cheap. You want to produce a truthful account of an economic crisis, of history, of whatever it is, you need to invest time, money, effort in doing research, analyzing. If you just write the first thing that comes to your mind, it's cheap. Secondly, the truth tends to be complicated because reality is complicated.
Yes.
Fiction can be as simple as you would like it to be.
Yeah.
You know, Jon Snow wanted to investigate what causes cholera. Not only he had to invest a lot of time and effort, but the actual process, there is these tiny microbes in the cesspool and they get into the drinking water and then they get into your body. Very complicated to understand a pandemic. If you just believe, it's witches that are casting a black magic on us, that's very simple.
Very simple.
Most people prefer simple stories. And the last thing, the truth tends to be painful sometimes. Not always, but often the truth about us personally or collectively is unattractive, whereas fiction can be as attractive as you'd like it to be. Democracies are made possible only by information technology. Democracy, in essence, is a conversation. A group of people conversing, talking, trying to make decisions together. Dictatorship is one person dictates everything. That's dictatorship. Now, in the Stone Age, hunter-gatherers living in small bands, they were mostly democratic. Whenever the band needed to decide anything, they could just talk with each other. As human societies grew bigger, it just became technically difficult to hold the conversation. The only examples we have from the
ancient world for democracies are small city-states, like Athens or Republican Rome. These are the two most famous examples, not the only ones, but the most famous. Even philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they knew once you go beyond the level of a city-state, democracy is impossible. We do not know of a single example from the pre-modern world of a large-scale democracy. Large-scale democracy becomes possible only in the late modern era when a couple of information technologies appear. First the newspaper, then telegraph and radio and television, and they make large-scale democracy possible.
Imagine an AI that makes billions of dollars. The richest person in the US in a few years will not be Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, it will be an AI. And this AI has the freedom of speech, which includes the right to donate money to politicians, maybe on condition that they further advance rights for AI. This is a completely realistic scenario. This is a question that we as a society need to decide, do we acknowledge AIs as persons with rights? There are people who are already convinced that AIs, because they have interaction with them, have consciousness, feelings. So maybe in a few years, the world is divided between countries that recognize AIs as persons with rights and countries that don't.